One thing the 16 days of the Olympics will provide is a perfect backdrop for protesters. We've seen some already with students, 2 British students, arrested and deported from Beijing for protesting on Tibet. But protest is in the air. We were hearing earlier about the climate camp down in Kent, which may close a power station today. So let's reflect on what makes a good protest, or a bad one, with 2 practiced experts. Mark Thomas is the comedian and activist who, I believe, is in the Guinness Book of Records for holding the most protests in the restricted zone outside Parliament. Is that
yes, that's
Mark?
correct.
It is. Also on the line is David Aaronavitch, a Times columnist these days, but back in 1968, in his more radical teen years, he took part in that famous march outside the American embassy. Well, good morning to you both. I suppose if we ask what makes a good protest, David, mass rallies like that one back in the 60s, they look a bit 60s and 70s, don't they? It's the clever stunt that people seem to search for these days.
Well, I mean, if what you're looking for is publicity rather than something that's more self-referential, a lot of protest is about kind of going along and meeting your pals and doing the things that you've always done. But if you're looking for something that has some kind of an impact, in other words, it gets into newspapers or that might get into the Today programme, more particularly gets on 24-hour news and then is on the news bulletins, it's got to look like something. So the 2 things really are that it's got to be a stunt of some kind which has a kind of visual aspect. And the second thing is the timing is everything. So in Beijing, for instance, it was a race to see who would be the first people to get arrested in Beijing doing a protest and so on, and that was always going to be the people who would get the most publicity.
Mark Thomas, what makes a good protest in your view?
Well, I agree with David to a certain degree there, that actually what you need is something that actually grabs people's attention, grabs people's eye, if you're looking for publicity. But if you remember the anti-war march, that was huge. What you actually had there, for example, what made that protest was the size of it, and it showed the size of discontent and actually opposition to the war. So actually, it depends what you're campaigning about that makes a good protest. Some people actually, I mean, more importantly, David kind of touched on this, it's not just about getting in the news that people protest for. They protest because actually it's fundamental to them as their right to freedom of expression, to say something, to be dissenting, to not go along with something.
They want to be on the news. I mean, isn't the goal? Look, I'll speak with the Economist hat on. What
no,
they're
that's
trying to do is
rubbish.
They're trying to find
absolute nonsense.
The lowest cost way of having a very high impact. And obviously, mustering a crowd of 1 million is a very high impact, but it's a very high cost way of getting an impact. Whereas Fathers for Justice, for example, 2 or 3 guys can make a very high impact. Are you suggesting that everyone on the march for the anti-war march just wanted to get on the news? No.
You're not suggesting that.
No, but that is one of the ways through which these have an active ingredient, isn't
Look, the point being is there's masses of demonstrations that take place which the media do not cover, and actually people who are taking part in these demonstrations are quite thankful of that fact, because they're there to do their thing. They're there to do something specific. Demonstrating can either be an end in itself, i.e. you want to get on the news and spread the message around, or it can be something that is intrinsically part of a campaign, so it has different objectives. So, for example, when I was doing demonstrating in the Sokpa zone, which is where you need to get permission to demonstrate, one person with one banner needs permission from the police, what myself and others did was we did mass applications to demonstrate, and we just stand there with our one banner, and the whole point was to tie the police up with their own paperwork. It wasn't about getting publicity. So it depends on what your demonstration is.
David Aaronavitch, I'm not convinced by the argument yet that people are not after publicity.
No, I think Mark's right, actually. I think there are people who do say to themselves, here I am, I can do no other sometimes. They say to themselves, I've got to say something because I feel so cross about this. There are others who think this is a kind of vaguely trendy thing to do, I'll amble down. There are people who are told this is going to be a huge protest, it's going to be one of those moments, a bit like, you know, the kind of protest equivalent of going and seeing the coffin of the Queen Mother, who say, oh, everybody's going down there, I better go and do that. But if we're talking about what increasingly works, if you think about how Fathers for Justice took an issue which wasn't on the radar and put it there somehow, despite the fact that everybody kind of criticised and said they were a very unlovely bunch, by a series of stunts involving remarkably few people doing remarkably small things and so on, that is really a sign of a very, very successful protest.
Mark Thomas, a lot of good protests, in terms of having some impact at least, are those that involve a degree of light law-breaking. Not too heavy a law-breaking, but something that is at least going to antagonise the authorities.
I think you're right to a degree there, because I mean, certainly if you look at Fathers for Justice, what made Fathers for Justice work wasn't just the fact that they're dressed up brightly, and it wasn't just the fact that they broke the law, it was the fact they had a mobile telephone to talk to the media. Actually, that was the thing that really broke through, because suddenly people could be on the top of a roof, like people were for playing stupid on top of Parliament, and they could talk to the media about why they're on Parliament's roof.
Oh, yeah, so the technology used there. Are you still protesting at all, David? Do you do any of your protesting days gone, very briefly?
I occasionally think about it, but I actually very rarely get round. Very rarely get round to doing it. The sort of things that I feel strongly about, nobody seems to organise a protest about very much, really. So,
well, let us know what it is, David, and I'll do one for you.
Mark Thomas will do one. Well, thank you both, protesters all, Mark Thomas and David Aaronavitch.